Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So this is a quick preview and prediction for Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Egidijus Kavaliauskas. This fight goes down on the 14th of August and it takes place in Frisco, Texas. Now this is a fight I'm actually looking forward to, so I thought I'd make this video now. To tell you the truth, in the last few weeks or so, I've really kind of struggled with boxing, covering it. You know, in the last few weeks, not too much has caught my eye, if I'm being honest. And also the dumpster fire that is boxing social media doesn't exactly fill you with enthusiasm. But what we do have in the next few weeks are some good fights coming up. And this is one of them in my opinion. So yeah, hopefully in the next few weeks or so, my motivation and passion for boxing is reignited. But yeah, Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Egidijus Kavaliauskas. A solid fight for Vergil Ortiz Jr. at this stage of his career. As we know, Vergil Ortiz is one of the hottest prospects in the welterweight division. Well, I guess at this point you could call him a contender, and Kavaliauskas is what I would describe as a dangerous, hard-punching fringe contender, so I think it's a good bit of matchmaking for Vergil Ortiz Jr. I think it's an ideal fight for this stage of his career, and potentially a fight in which Vergil Ortiz Jr. will have to answer some questions. So, all in all, it's a fight I'm looking forward to. But let's briefly break down the tale of the tape, and we shall start with Vergil Ortiz Jr. Vergil Ortiz Jr. has a perfect record of 17-0, all 17 wins coming by way of knockout. Egidijus Kavaliauskas has a respectable record of 22-1-1, 18 of his 22 wins coming by way of knockout, the loss coming to Terence Crawford, and the draw coming against Ray Robinson. So as a pro, Kavaliauskas is certainly more experienced. You can tell that from the records. Even in terms of amateur background, Kavaliauskas fought at a much higher level in the amateurs. So, you know, Kavaliauskas, that experience is something that he needs to fall back on in this fight to give himself the best chance of winning. But Vergil Ortiz Jr., he is listed as 5'10" with a 70-inch reach, whereas Egidijus Kavaliauskas is listed as 5'9" with a 71-inch reach. So Vergil Ortiz Jr. is 1 inch taller, but Kavaliauskas does have a 1-inch reach advantage, so these guys are of a similar size. Vergil Ortiz Jr. is 23 years old, whereas Egidijus Kavaliauskas is 33 years old. Both of these guys are orthodox fighters. So now the tale of the tape is out of the way, let's briefly break down what I believe each guy should do to stand the best chance of winning, and at the end of the video I will make my official prediction. I guess we start with the favourite, Vergil Ortiz Jr. Now Vergil Ortiz Jr. going into this fight, it is viewed as a test for him, but he's expected to win. Vergil Ortiz Jr. for my money is a more versatile fighter than Kavaliauskas. I've seen Vergil Ortiz do a multitude of different things in comparison to Egidijus Kavaliauskas. I've seen Vergil Ortiz keep it long and box behind the jab. I've seen Vergil Ortiz Jr. apply pressure. I've seen him counterpunch. You know, he's quite well versed in that ring, Vergil Ortiz Jr. But I think with Vergil Ortiz Jr., he's got a natural aptitude of being aggressive. Ultimately, he likes to apply pressure and kind of force the fight. He's that sort of guy naturally. That's his psyche, that's his mental makeup. And in this fight, I'm not saying he needs to abandon that, but he needs to be, I would say, a lot more wary of what is coming back. We saw in the Maurice Hooker fight, Vergil Ortiz basically overpowered Maurice Hooker, but he was getting caught with shots coming in, and Kavaliauskas arguably hits harder than Maurice Hooker at welterweight. So I think Vergil Ortiz Jr. definitely needs to be aware of that power in this fight. If he is to apply pressure, his high guard needs to be a lot tighter than it was against Maurice Hooker. I have seen Vergil Ortiz use a tight high guard before, and he actually keeps himself protected quite well, but against Maurice Hooker, I just felt he was a little careless at times and a little too loose with his defense. So whenever Vergil is forcing the fight in this one, I want to see a much tighter high guard, and also I think Vergil in this fight needs to be doing everything off that jab. Even when he's applying pressure, he needs to be constantly firing that jab. With Kavaliauskas, if you exchange with him in the pocket or at mid-range, he's very dangerous. Kavaliauskas can fire that straight right or the overhand right. We saw that in the Crawford fight when Crawford was exchanging with wide punches. Kavaliauskas was managing to time Terence Crawford quite regularly in that fight. In fact, he dropped Terence Crawford and never got the credit for it. So, in this fight, Vergil needs to make sure that he's managing his distance, keeping Kavaliauskas at arm's length and behind straight punches. You can still apply pressure with straight punches, and I think Vergil needs to be utilising that a lot more in this fight. An authoritative jab coming forwards and that straight right hand down the middle. And yeah, I think he needs to make sure that Kavaliauskas is always at the end of his punches. I don't think Kavaliauskas is anywhere near as dangerous on the outside as he is at mid-range and even in the pocket. I think a risky strategy for Vergil Ortiz Jr. would be to approach this like the Maurice Hooker fight, where he was a bit lazy with his defense and he was kind of, trying to really crowd Maurice Hooker and throw wide looping punches, hooks to the body, hooks to the head, uppercuts through the middle. I think if he kind of engages Kavaliauskas in that sort of fight, it's definitely more risky. I still believe he can beat Kavaliauskas that way, but what's coming back could have more effect, and Kavaliauskas could get more shots off if Vergil Ortiz takes that approach. So I want to see a technical pressure game from Vergil Ortiz in this fight, coming in behind the jab, behind the straight right hand, keeping Kavaliauskas at arm's length and try and apply pressure that way, even behind shifting. To me, Vergil Ortiz Jr., when he utilises shifting to close the distance and apply pressure, I actually think he does it quite well. I don't see many young fighters apply that technique of shifting, and I'm sure you guys know what shifting is. Guys like Gennady Golovkin and Artur Beterbiev have performed that in recent years, and it's a very effective way of applying pressure, and ultimately the best pressure fighters use their feet, hence why guys like Golovkin, Artur Beterbiev have been so successful in recent years. It all comes from their feet when they're applying pressure. Even back in the day, Roberto Duran would also use the shifting technique, and I want to see Vergil Ortiz build on that. I've seen Vergil do it in certain fights. He does it quite well. Doesn't do it enough for my liking, but he can apply that shifting technique while still keeping Egidijus Kavaliauskas at arm's length. Shifting works extremely well with straight punches, so I'd like to see that from Vergil Ortiz in this fight. And ultimately, who knows, maybe Vergil might actually try to do something different. Maybe he'll try and box and move. Maybe he'll try and box off a jab, but in a more conservative fashion. I actually believe he can win the fight doing that, to be honest. I think he's got the skill set to be a bit more conservative and win this fight on points behind the jab and basically be the boxer puncher. I think he can win this fight that way as well. But, like I said earlier, I think Vergil's natural aptitude is to be aggressive, so I believe he'll do that in this fight. And I think Vergil's going to be Vergil, but he just needs to tighten up a little bit, kind of thing. And because who knows, if Kavaliauskas catches him, then he may be able to hurt him. So Vergil's definitely got something to look out for in this fight. As for Egidijus Kavaliauskas, I think it's in his best interest to start this fight extremely quickly and, try and basically apply relentless pressure, get to the mid-range and be inside. And essentially, he needs to drag Vergil Ortiz Jr. into a horrible fight. He needs to really drag the green Vergil Ortiz to somewhere he's never been. Test that body, test that chin, test that gas tank, and really make Vergil Ortiz Jr. second guess himself. Maurice Hooker had some success against Vergil Ortiz, but not to the point where it was life and death or you ever thought that the fight was kind of slipping away from Vergil Ortiz. Vergil was always in control in that fight. He's never really had that sort of fight where he's going to be internally asking himself questions. Do I want this? Do I have the heart for this? It's up to Kavaliauskas to make it that sort of fight. And he needs to break the young green Vergil Ortiz Jr. And for me, he needs to spend as much time in this fight at mid-range or on the inside. And ultimately, chip away at that body, maintain a good work rate. I think the overhand right potentially could be a shot that will work for Kavaliauskas in this fight, especially if he finds himself at mid-range and Vergil Ortiz is exchanging with him. Problem with Vergil Ortiz, sometimes he stands kind of upright and square on when he's exchanging, and I like the way Kavaliauskas kind of throws the overhand right. He'll kind of get low and compact and basically come up with it, and sometimes it's hard to read. And I think, if he's got Vergil Ortiz square on and Vergil is exchanging, the overhand right could be a key shot for Kavaliauskas. Not only could it hurt Vergil, maybe it could drop him if he's square on. So he needs to be looking out for the overhand right in this fight and when to throw it, because that's one shot I see Vergil as somewhat open to. So Kavaliauskas needs to look out for that. And yeah, ultimately going into this fight, Kavaliauskas is the underdog. I don't think he's even got a promoter going into this fight. He used to be with Top Rank, but I think they released him. So he's basically going into this fight a free agent. Nobody's out to bat for him. He really needs to leave it all in the ring, not try and sneak a decision or anything like that. He's going to be up against it. He's on a DAZN show, a Golden Boy show. Golden Boy have a lot of stock in Vergil Ortiz Jr. They expect big things from him. So, Kavaliauskas needs to really go in there and let it all hang out. Another thing, he needs a much better gas tank than he displayed against Terence Crawford. He was doing well in the Terence Crawford fight. He won a few rounds. He hurt Crawford. He dropped him. That fight was very competitive until the midway stage, and that's when Kavaliauskas basically started to gas out. And, in this fight, he needs to be ready for 12 rounds. I hope he's been concentrating on that cardio, getting the miles in, doing the skipping and whatnot, doing the bag work, because it could be one of those fights for him. Ultimately, it would be last chance saloon for Kavaliauskas if he's really serious about fighting for a title again at 33 years old. He needs to win this fight. So Kavaliauskas needs to leave it all on the table here. Hopefully he comes in prepared, fit, ready. If he does, I believe he can give Vergil Ortiz Jr. issues. Because of the power, the experience, and Kavaliauskas is a decent fighter as well, to be honest, and the most dangerous fight of Ortiz's career because of the power. But ultimately, I think the safe bet is Vergil Ortiz Jr. And I believe Vergil Ortiz Jr. in this fight will get the stoppage, and I believe more than likely it will be a late stoppage, basically anything from like round 9 onwards. I don't think Kavaliauskas is just going to fall down. He'll need to be tenderised. He'll need to get hit with a few shots. And I think that's what will happen. I'm sure Kavaliauskas will land some good shots here and there, make it competitive in spots. I wouldn't even be surprised if Kavaliauskas maybe hurts Vergil Ortiz and gives him a few scary moments, but ultimately I've got Vergil Ortiz winning this fight by a late stoppage. What about you guys? How are you picking this one? I've actually seen quite a few people pick Kavaliauskas to pull off the upset. I've actually seen quite a few comments picking Kavaliauskas. So share your thoughts below. Who are you picking to win this fight and how? Share your thoughts below. Been your guy Del Boy. Peace.